Okay, so here we are. This lecture here, we're going to focus on Taoism. I'm going to try as best as I can to fit all the Taoist material on one lecture. There will be a discussion on the readings from Taoism, but this is the only lecture over just sort of a general overview of this tradition. And for my students who are taking this course online, if you skipped Shinto and you did Sikhism instead, then this would be the first tradition that we're looking at in Unit 2, which is religions of the Far East, or religions and traditions of the Far East, I guess we should say. It's debatable whether or not Confucianism is a religion per se. But anyway, so this is either the first or second, depending on what you planned. And as I said, this might be a little bit longer than the other lectures in the series, just because I don't think there's really enough for two full videos, maybe a little bit too much for one, but we'll see how it goes. I'm going to time myself a bit here and make sure that I don't go over an hour and 20 minutes or something like that, but again, it shouldn't even be that long. So without further ado, as I said, this is the series, or this is the lecture from the series on Taoism. Occasionally you'll see, and I do this a lot, I'm used to the different spelling, the Wade Giles with the T. There are two systems of translation, or Latinization, I guess you could say, changing the Chinese characters to Latin, the Latin alphabet. Sometimes it's with the T, sometimes it's with the D. Our textbook has a D, the textbook we're using for this course, Living Religions, 10th edition. So we'll just go with that. But I'm so used to the T, the TAO, that I might mess up myself, right? So you'll see in these slides, it's probably not completely consistent. But what we're dealing with here is really just the folk religion that goes back to ancient China. It permeates culture even before what are considered sort of the founding fathers of Taoism, Lao Tzu and Chuang Tzu. But again, this what us Western scholars refer to as Taoism is going to be a broad category. The similar conundrum we saw in the unit on Hinduism. You've got this this very geographically isolated area, right? The to the south here, you've got the mountains here in western India, to the southwest. And so all this stuff is sort of geographically isolated and develops its own sort of culture. And throughout, it's a huge region. So throughout all these regions, there's all these different folk beliefs and folk religions. And so a lot of times Western scholars will give this label Taoism to, again, just a folk religion, traditions that have gone back to the time before figures like Confucius and Lao Tzu. And so just sort of keep that in mind. If you encounter someone in the West, someone like me, someone who looks like me, some white dude, or who says, "Oh, I love Taoism. Y'all are studying Taoism. That's awesome." They're probably thinking of what's called philosophical Taoism, where in the textbook it's literati Taoism. So what we're talking about is a little bit broader than that. And some would argue based on those teachings or based on those two figures, Lao Tzu and Zhou, who wrote the early texts of the Taoist tradition. But what we're calling, Taoism here, we can talk about folk Taoism, religious Taoism, and then I guess literati or philosophical Taoism. So we'll get into the details once we get through some of these slides. But just some basic terminology that I want to get off the ground, because these are concepts that are going to be very useful when we get to Confucianism as well. They take on different meanings, and I'm going to be using them throughout this lecture too. So let's get some, and there'll be more terminology coming up, but just sort of to set some ground rules here, let's just get started with some basics. Okay, concept of Li. I'm just going to keep it at this: sacred ritual. Okay, with all those connotations, sacred. So far in this course, we've seen all sorts of different connotations of what is sacred, what's understood as sacred. So just, all that, sacred. Ritual, same thing, a lot of connotations to that word. Things that you do as a part of the religious practice. repetitive habits, repetitive actions. And so Li has this broad meaning. Now we'll see when we get to other forms of Taoism, and especially when we get to Confucianism, it takes on some more specific, it still means the same thing in a certain sense, but it has certainly different connotations. Okay. Now, Qi, this is a term that Westerners might be familiar with. If you hang out in enough yoga circles, you might hear someone talking about their chi and controlling their chi. In fact, this is, which is odd to me. I would always think that prana would be like the right term to use in a yoga circle, because that's sort of the more Hindu term for what's being referred to here as this energy, this life force. Okay, so we all have chi in us, and it's self-generating energy. It's throughout the cosmos. And then, of course, the term Tao itself, which I prefer to leave untranslated. If you see translations of the Dao De Jing, most of the time it'll all be in English except for that one word, the Tao. But if they do translate it, it's typically translated as the way, the way of nature. Sometimes I'm missing the close quotes there. So yeah, I told you these slides weren't perfect. So let's do a little bit of Chinese history. I'm by no means an expert on any of this, so I'm not going to give you too much details. But again, China in general, let's go back to the map. Again, geographically isolated from the rest of the world historically. By 2000 BC, it has a written language, musical instruments, bronze, silk, ceramics, ivory. All of this develops in isolation from the West. Ancestor worship is common. There are funerals, mourning rites, not mourning as in waking up in the morning, but mourning over the dead, sacrifices. There's this belief that, this is some of the earliest beliefs about ancestors helping descendants if they are treated with respect. And again, sacred rituals are developed, Li, are developed to do this, okay? Divination bones, right? Bones are thrown to predict outcomes or to tell fortunes. You throw bones with questions etched on them. The notion that the world is full of spirits. I guess this ties into this concept of Qi. There are nature spirits, human deities, etc. This tradition tells of 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors, and this period between 4000 and 3000 BC, this is prehistory in China. There's the idea that there's these sort of 5 emperors that succeed one another. The first is Shangdi, the Yellow Emperor, who is he's understood to be the symbolic ancestor of China, and he's credited with writing, music, art. He created all these things. He started what became known as the Taoist tradition. Okay, this is religious Taoism we're talking about here. We haven't got to the more commonly known philosophical Taoism. So some people who might be stumbling across this video with some Westerners, again, someone who might look and talk a little bit like I do. You might, this is not Taoism. Where's Swazi? Where's Lao Tzu? This guy doesn't know what he's talking about. No, this is what philosophy. This is what scholars of religion, comparative religious scholars, refer to as Taoism, and it's a broad category. We'll get to what you have in mind probably about halfway through this lecture. Okay, so hold your horses. So again, Huangdi is considered the beginner of all these traditions, but not just these religious and spiritual practices, the religious Taoism, but also all the writing in ancient China. So again, he's thought to be just a mythical figure. He probably represents somebody who might have actually existed, but he's supposed to be the first emperor, the Yellow Emperor. Okay, and he's a part of this the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperor period between 3000 BCE. The Xia dynasty, this is where the name Asia, I believe, originates. This is the first dynasty, the first dynastic order. This is thought to have existed between 2200 and 1750 BCE. And it's considered the fountainhead of culture, bronze, silk, The use of the wheel is introduced during this period. Again, all of this stuff is unverifiable historically. This is part of tradition. We don't get to a historical dynasty until the Shang period. So the Shang period is 1751 to 1123, and this figure Shangdi actually, who, and I'm probably not pronouncing these correctly, and I'm sure also too, depending on whether, what part of China or what part of the Asian Peninsula you're from, these figures might be go by slightly different names or pronounced quite differently in Mandarin or Cantonese. So please keep that in mind. My pronunciations obviously are not exact and they're not precise. But again, Shangdi, he's, this figure here, he's known as the Lord on High. That's, I guess, basically a rough English translation. He is a spiritual being, though. He's understood as a spiritual being and a ruler of the universe, the supreme ancestor of China, and a number of gods and spirits. So, he brings forth all these lesser gods, the gods of agriculture. Within the notion of the Tao, though, there's this primary concern, right, with the harmony between heaven and earth. These are seen as dependent upon one another, and all the deities that are involved in this cosmic order seem to be subordinate to Shangdi. So he's this masculine figurehead god, but he's not a creator god. So don't get confused. He's not like the Chinese version of God. He's not. Don't try to understand Shangdi as the Judeo-Christian monotheistic. He's simply the king or the ruler of the cosmic order, if that makes any sense. All the deities, again, are subordinate to him. I mean, he's involved in human affairs, but he's not the creator. So rulers start to take over the northeastern tribes towards the Shang period. Again, this is 17. Your textbook, I'm going with your textbook, okay? This map that I have here has different dates. So, these are probably fairly super duper rough dates to begin with. So don't get all crazy about this. So your textbook has 1751 to 1123 BCE. So it goes back a little bit further. Maybe this is an old map and we've discovered, this textbook's fairly recent. So maybe the textbook, maybe it's taken into account new archaeological or historical evidence that suggests the Shang goes back even further to the 1500 BC. Okay, but dates aren't super important. The point is, Shang is the first historical dynasty. All the northeastern tribes are unified, right? So it's this sort of unification under one dynastic order in the northeast here of China. And the rulers start to establish a theocracy, okay? So a rule where their religious beliefs become a part of the established political order, right? Theocracy. And they establish themselves as divine rulers who are defenders and serve the people in the midst of these cultural traditions, again, that we think go back much further, right? That we think they go back, thousands of years to the, most ancient China. So the rulers in the Shang dynasty start to claim that they're the only ones who have contact with Shangdi, right? They're the Shang dynasty. And they think that, they have the public, or I guess eventually, maybe not everybody believes this, but eventually the idea is inculcated into the public that the Shangdi, the Shang dynasty is necessary for society to function. They have to observe the proper respect for their rulers, because again, the rulers have to have this claim of divine power, very similar to the divine right of kings in the West. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we get to Judaism and Christianity and Islam. The notion of, earthly rulers are given a sort of divine right by the deities. So social ranks in ancient China are thought to parallel these divine ranks. And like many of these traditions we talked about in the early Hindu, what became known as Hinduism, in the early part of that tradition, animal sacrifice, burnt altars and things like this were a big part of the early, what some people call the Vedic tradition, the early Vedism before Brahmanism takes over Hinduism. Similar development here in the Shang dynasty, though there's a tendency away from sacrifices, but these become it goes back and forth, so it's not an exact parallel. I think when you get to the Zhou dynasty, this one is it's tricky. The Duke of Zhou, by the way, okay, so there's a big rebellion and they overthrow the Shang. And so there needs to be some sort of explanation for this. If the Shang is a sort of has a direct line to the gods, then how is the Zhou, or, how is the Zhou to defend themselves? This big rebellion happens, and when they take over, they hold on to the sort of high culture of the Shang, the bronze, the silk, the writing, all of this stuff. They bring back sacrifices, oddly enough, but they have to justify their rebellion, and they do this with the notion of Qianming, which literally, and I don't have it written out here. That book is that term is in your textbook. Qianming. It's Latinized different ways. T-I-E-N, Tian Ming, M-I-N-G. It's typically translated as mandate of heaven, and the Duke of Zhou is thought to have been the first to have proclaimed this, to have proclaimed Qianming. Again, I mentioned the Shang dynasty talked about how they had a direct line to the deities, the divinities, and that they knew what the proper way to order society was. So that was what justified their earthly rule. So it's not that this is some new idea, but under the Duke of Zhou, it becomes, I guess, a part of the creed, and there's a term for it, Qianming, again, the mandate of heaven. Again, think the divine right of kings. Morality and the welfare of humans is a primary concern, and the idea is that if you respect the rulers, and if the rulers respect their duties as rulers, then everything will be in harmony, right? Again, there's this quest for harmony that no matter what stripe of Taoism you're talking about, that seems to be a recurring theme, whether it's a harmonizing between some supernatural spirits and humanity, or whether it's just harmonizing within yourself. Again, this harmonization of opposition is one key theme that you're going to see throughout Taoism. And this is probably one reason also that Buddhism has such a big influence on Taoism. We'll talk a little bit about that in this lecture towards the end. When Buddhism spreads east, it starts to pick up some Taoism, and Taoism starts to pick up some Buddhism. And so you'll see there's influences across both traditions. So again, Duke of Zhou, he's the first to claim himself as the son of heaven, proclaiming this mandate of heaven. The common people, they can address the gods directly, and power shifts from ancestor to morality. So you might be thinking, if you're familiar with some of the early practices of the Christian church, early forms of Christianity, when the church was starting to become established as a political power, you weren't supposed to pray to God. The priest would pray for you. That was a big part of confession, the whole confessional. That was the whole point, because the priest knew how to speak for the gods. That really doesn't seem to be the case here, at least as far as we can tell. The people were allowed to pray and devote and do things and rituals in reverence for the gods, and not necessarily under the direction of the rulers or some divine, priest, although that was definitely part of some of the rituals. So it wasn't quite as there wasn't quite as much of a bifurcation. However, again, there was this very strict code of hierarchy within society. You weren't supposed to question your betters. You weren't supposed to question those in power. You're supposed to sort of stick to your place, because society itself was seen as a reflection of the cosmic order. Now, this gets a little bit more complicated when we get to the philosophical Taoism. We start talking about Xuanzu. Things get a little bit different. But here we're still talking about Chinese history. We're still talking about the early dynasties and how they helped develop and shape some of these early religious traditions that, eventually become what we now call religious Taoism. So I think I've talked enough about this. Maybe I should have kept this slide up as I was explaining all this stuff, right? But again, there's this notion of a divine hierarchy. Remember, Shangdi is the Lord on high. He's seen as, you know, the highest of all the deities. You'll see statues of him if you go to you know, some of the you know, parts of Houston, like Chinatown over on Bel Air. If you go to some of you know, a Vietnamese restaurant, you know, even Vietnamese restaurants, Chinese food, you know, Chinese marketplaces. There's tons of that here in Houston, right? We have a huge Vietnamese population. So you'll see, if you look, you'll see statues. I'll back up and show you again, because most of my students, of course, they're here in Houston. You will see this. Now you'll start noticing him when you go out and you go to places that, you know, like I'm talking about here, local places where there's a heavy concentration of people from the Far East, that descent. You'll see, you know, statues of, you know, little figurines of Shangdi. And again, he's at the top, right? He's at the top of the mountain. But the idea is, again, that there's a sort of one-to-one correspondence between all these deities and spirits in the cosmic order, the higher realm of the heavens, and the world of humans. And the good Taoist, I suppose, the good practitioner of the tradition, will find some reconciliation between these two. So, you know, in general, their cosmology, right, their theory of the cosmos involves this notion of yin yang, right, or yin yang. It's really, everybody says yin yang in America. In fact, I get corrected all the time when I say yin yang, but yin yang is much closer to the Chinese pronunciation. So I'll probably keep saying it. The yin is the female, the dark, the receptive. The yang is the male, the bright, the assertive. So if you ever see the yin yang symbol, see there, I did it, right? I go back and forth myself. You know, the white represents the male, the dark, the female, light, dark, positive, negative, passive, assertive. And, you know, these are very, you know, some people think these are pretty sexist, you know, stereotypical, etc. Look, I'm just giving you the facts. This is what the Chinese cosmology believes in. Whether you agree with, you know, traditional gender roles or not, this is not the topic at hand. We're talking about ancient Chinese religion, so just keep this in mind. The idea is, though, that the black is not bad. It's just a necessary complementary force to the light, and they complement each other, and no one thing is purely one or the other. This is not, I think, really touched upon in your textbook, but that's really the symbolism there with the dots. You see that one side is white and one side is black, but no side is completely one or the other. All have that, you know, that one little dot. I've had, you know, one I guess, teacher of the Tao. I hate to call him a Taoist sage, but someone, you know, someone who I respected, who studies this stuff as well. He described it as, you know, the Taoist tries to sort of follow the flow of this line in the middle, whereas most people are going to be in one extreme or the other, right? You're going to be in this very light, assertive, everything's black and white, everything is rigid, falls into like one category or the other, very sort of rational, orderly way of thinking, but that gets so rigid that you sort of seek escape into the yang, right? Or sorry, into the yin, into the dark, right? And so most of us struggle and we oscillate between the two, right? We get a little too rigid and we want to loosen up, maybe party, and then all of a sudden here we are, where now we're back in the negative yin, and everything is sort of like chaotic, and we're just letting go of the rails and going crazy. And then after a while that gets a mess, and we want order in our lives, we want stability. So we dive right towards that light of the yang energy. But backing up. Then we're back over there again, too much bright. But, you know, again, as this, you know, old professor of mine, you know, studier of, teacher of the Tao, I guess you could call him, it says the Taoist wants to sort of, you know, the true Taoist sage with wisdom that follows the way, that follows the Tao, the way of the universe, the smooth flow of the universe, is able to balance in the middle here, in this little curve in the middle. Their life is a sort of flow. That's the idea. So these two polar forces, again, they complement each other. The yin is the female, the dark, the receptive. The yang is the male, the bright, assertive. The creative rhythm of the universe itself is called the Tao, or the way. We already talked about qi, the self-generating energy. and the cosmos itself is a manifestation of this energy. Um, so we have to keep these two polar forces in harmony. Nothing is outside this process of the Tao in Chinese cosmology, right? Everything is the way. The five elements that make up the universe are water, fire, wood, metal, and earth. And the I Ching, right, which some Westerners also might be familiar with, is one of the most ancient books and one of the most influential books in Chinese history, and it certainly has a big impact on this tradition, on the Taoist tradition, on religious Taoism. And I Ching teaches of a way to tap into the flow of the universe and to understand it through divination. Divination is a term I think that's come up before. If you don't know it by now, you should. Shame on you. You need to look it up. But basically, trying to predict things about maybe the future, about yourself, to find insights about one's self through instructions from the gods, from the spirit world. That's why it's called divination. And I Ching is thought to be a way to this. And so often people, again, they will throw yarrow sticks or coins. They toss them randomly and they will fall. And based on the patterns that they fall in, they will produce hexagrams. And the hexagrams, the book of I Ching, you know, again, there's yang lines and yin lines, and it gets really technical. I really don't know all the, you know, the sort of what exactly the procedure is you do to understand like which of the hexagrams you're supposed to read. But you know, I have a couple copies of I Ching. I got a Taoist I Ching here and a Confucian I Ching and a Buddhist I Ching. I guess I have 2 or 3 of them, and they have all got different interpretations of every possible combination of hexagram, right? So some of these yarrow sticks are yin and some are yang, and it just depends on like how they fall. That's what you interpret, right? You ask a question, you throw them, and then it gives you an answer. So, okay, a little bit more about a little bit more Chinese history here. Again, very brief history. Don't know a whole lot about it myself, honestly. So I'm just sort of giving you just sort of some dates. 8th to 3rd century is a really important part. This is still BC. This is the period of warring states. You hear about this, you know, this is a period that's talked about a lot in some of the scriptures, some of the scriptures of Confucius, and some of these traditions were thought to be born out of the period of the warring states. And all these sort of schools of thought, where we're talking about Taoism, Confucianism, I've got a couple listed here: Moism, legalist, or legalisms, those different schools of thought, they were all responses to this very chaotic period within China where it was unable to become unified under one dynasty, right? It just kept going back and forth, a very violent, turbulent time. And so a lot of these philosophies, these, you know, the Taoist philosophy, the Confucian philosophy, they're responses to this disorder and trying to find harmony and order within chaos. And so, you know, if you want to do a research paper, maybe that would be something to do one on the period of warring states and how, you know, how to have an impact on. It'd be overwhelming to do a whole paper on the whole thing, but maybe, you know, what sort of events in this period had a direct effect on a Confucian philosophy or a Taoist philosophy, you know, get more specific. That'd be a good research topic. I'd love to read it so I could learn more and be a better teacher. But just really quick here, there are a couple other schools that really haven't persisted. They have the staying power, I suppose, at least in China, as other schools like Confucianism and Taoism and certain forms of Buddhism that migrated east. But Moism it's this teaching, you know, the teacher of it, Mo Tzu, you know, some of his writings actually survive. He was a very enigmatic figure. Who came from peasantry, right? He was, you know, from the lower classes. And Moism seems to be very much like, very similar. I don't want to say it's the same thing, but it's very similar to the Western philosophy of utilitarianism. So if you're familiar with utilitarianism, particularly the brand of John Stuart Mill, the sort of, you know, as much happiness for as many people and as little pain for you know as possible, right? So the notion behind Motsu is that we have to care and love for everybody. There don't need to be social classes. You can't care more about the king than you care about the peasant. And this is very anti-Confucian, by the way. You'll see in the next lecture when we get to Confucianism, it's all about social rank, social titles. Those are somehow a reflection of, again, this universal order in the cosmos, and they have to be respected. So Motsu didn't seem to share this view, and did not take on, didn't seem to have the historical staying power in the region that other schools of thought did. And this might be just for contingent reasons, just historical reasons, or cultural. Probably a little bit of both would be my guess. Okay, I'm not an expert on Chinese history, obviously. So the legalist school, for those of you who are familiar with the the Western philosopher Thomas Hobbes, Thomas Hobbes wrote the Leviathan, and Thomas Hobbes, you could argue, was living in a very similar time period in Great Britain, in England, during the time of the Civil War, during like the 1500s, during the 16th century. And so it was a very chaotic time where you had switching of power or whatever. And his response was, we need a dictator, basically. We need a Leviathan, a strong centralized power, which will cut your hand off if they catch you stealing a loaf of bread. So no one steals and everybody follows the rules. Just kind of a dictatorship. So that's kind of a legalist approach. We need a strong monarchy that's respected to instill order in society. Otherwise, people just won't behave. And that's sort of the legalist approach. So kind of, I guess, very extreme approaches, right? The kind of the opposite approach to a similar chaotic situation, right? This guy's like, hey, let's just love each other, let's unify. He's like, no, we're all rotten to the core. We need a strong dictator to just make us behave. That's the only way. No one's ever going to unify, right? Maybe this sort of centers around one's view of human nature, which is a big issue for Confucianism particularly. We'll talk about that when we get to Confucianism. Are humans good by nature? Are we bad by nature? Do we have to be trained to be good? Is goodness something that just comes from within? It's already there. These are debates within Confucianism as well. So anyway, now we're going to talk a little bit more about Taoism in general. As I said, it's a label that's invented by scholars to kind of distinguish this tradition from Confucianism. Usually when people talk about Taoism, they're thinking of the literati Taoism. If you bump into somebody and they're like, are you covering Taoism in that world religion class that you're taking? And you're like, yeah. And you start talking about Shangdi and the Warring States period, they're probably, huh? Hey, what about Lao Tzu? We're going to get to him. We're almost there. I promise you. We're just a second away. But anyway, the philosophical, or as your textbook has it, the literati Taoism, this is based on the ancient texts by these Taoist sages. And these books, these texts, I'm mainly talking about the Dao De Jing and the book of Zhou. They mainly focus on the concept itself of the Tao, right? The way. And they apply this notion of the way to social and political environments, depending on how you read the text, too. Many of the texts are very ambiguous and can be read in many contexts, not just social and political, but they can be taken on an individual level. They can be applied to all sorts of things. So, as I said earlier in the lecture, the notion of the Tao is an ancient concept that comes it precedes Confucius, it precedes Lao Tzu, or Lao Tzu, Lao Tzu, however you want to say it, Mandarin, Cantonese, he's thought to have written the Dao De Jing, okay? So the concept of Tao did not originate with him, but the notions of Taoism that we talk about now were definitely influenced by them. So even when you look at some of the Chinese practices, even though the notion of Tao, the notion of Qi, the notion of Li, these go back to ancient China, even before Lao Tzu, even before Chuang it's certainly the case that these books, the Dao De Jing, the book of Suang, to a lesser extent, had a big impact on how these traditions were shaped going forward. So what we call mystical and religious Taoism spring from this more popularly known philosophical Taoism. At least I'm just saying more popularly known in my part of the world. If you go to China, it's probably the other way around. You've got people who probably, they know quotes from the Dao De Jing and they know Lao Tzu and they maybe have shrines or, statues of him in their cities. but they're more familiar with the practices than they are the actual books. You know, they might know a line or two from the Dao De Jing. But again, Lao Tzu, he's the guy that apparently wrote the Dao De Jing. According to the tradition, he purportedly lived around the same time as Confucius, maybe about 53 years older, we think, about a half century older, around the middle of the 6th century, we think. And there's current archaeological evidence that dates him back even further. But the earliest version of the Dao De Jing is from 350 BCE that we have today, right? So still pretty old, but not quite as old as people think he lived. So it's almost 3 centuries after this guy. And some believe the Dao De Jing was actually an oral tradition, almost like some people think this about the Homeric poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, that there really wasn't a Homer. There might have been some figure who originated the tradition and is given credit for this, but he didn't really write all the poems. They were handed down and added to. There's a similar belief about the Dao De Jing. Some question or not whether or not Lao Tzu ever even existed, right? The legend is that he that he could speak when he was born, right? So there's all these very mystical versions of him. Like when he was like a baby, he could already talk, and he decides to withdraw from society because this is like during the Warring States period. So this picture of him I have on the right, where he's on an ox. This is kind of a typical image you'll see of Lao Tzu. You'll always know it's Lao Tzu if he's on this black ox, and the idea is that he got on this ox to leave his country to go across the border to another a neighboring province because the province he was in was just too chaotic. But the border guard knew that he was Lao Tzu, that he was this wise sage, and he said, look, I can't let you leave. You're too wise. You're too much of an asset to our country. He says, but I must go. I have to leave to save myself. And the guy's like, well, you have to write down all your wisdom. And so the idea is that this book, the Dao De Jing, the way and its power, or the Book of the Way, or the Way and its Free. There's many ways to translate it. In fact, I have an edition at home that gives you a key in the index so you can make your own translation. It gives you every Chinese character and every possible translation, so you can kind of make your own translation. It's called, I think, the Essential Dao De Jing. But anyway, the belief is that he wrote all his wisdom down in this book before he was allowed to leave the province where he resided. And that's the story. But again, this is partly myth, who knows, partly reality perhaps. But the point is that this book has been sort of the foundation for what's come to be known as religious mystical Taoism, and of course, obviously philosophical, or what your author, the textbook's author, is calling literati Taoism. Now, Zhuangzi or Zhuangzi, however you want to say it, he's the second sage. He's thought to have lived, sometime after Lao Tzu, but traditionally he's thought to be Lao Tzu's student. And the dates that we have in your textbook are 365 to 290, and that's still BC. Okay, so 365 to 290. The idea traditionally, the idea is that he was a government official. So he actually had some worldly power, but he left the political life for a hermit's life, and he preached a certain detachment from worldly affairs. He uses a lot of humor in his writing. So at least I think he's kind of funny. Some people might not. They're kind of, I guess, very intellectual kind of philosophy jokes. They're kind of jokes for nerds. But he is pretty clever, I gotta say. He's really my favorite. I love the Dao De Jing, but I gotta say, the Book of Zhuangzi is really one of my favorite books of all time. It's a really good book. It's very poetic. It's very beautiful. It's very mysterious. Some of its passages are very metaphorical and symbolic, and some of them are very just straightforward. And so it's got a mix of humor and poetry. And it talks about, this is another big theme that's not just, I think, in Zhuangzi, but it's certainly one of the things he talks about is this life living in harmony with the way of things, the way of the world, like the Tao, experiencing the transcendent unity of all things. All personal preferences have to cease. You have to accept and cooperate with things as they are. And don't get obsessed with moral classification, any kind of rigid standards, labels for things. The metaphor of flowing water is often used quite a bit. You must be like water, one who embraces the Tao both yields the way water yields and also overcomes, right? It can, cut through rock after thousands of years of persistence and make a canyon or a valley. And this seems rather paradoxical, but we'll talk about this. This is a notion of wu wei, acting without acting. But really briefly about Xuanzu, right? I have a couple photos. So before we get to wu wei and effortless action, just a couple anecdotes. He's most famous for the butterfly parable, where he talks about how he fell asleep next to the river. Again, the river is something that it's a common symbol throughout Taoist text. So he falls asleep meditating by the river, and he has a dream that he's a butterfly. But while he's dreaming, he doesn't remember he's Xuanzu. He thinks he's actually the butterfly, and totally forgets everything about himself. But when he wakes up, he thinks to himself, am I really Xuanzu dreaming that I'm a butterfly, or I'm a butterfly dreaming on Xuanzu? Why give one preference to one over the other? I have more attachment to my identity as Xuanzu. Is that really right? Does that make it true? This sort of reminds you, if you've ever taken a class in philosophy and studied Descartes, you might know about his whole evil genius and, how do I know I exist? And he says, I think, therefore I am. I don't want to get too sidetracked, but you might say that Xuanzu is like Descartes, but about 2,000 years earlier than the West about this. So kind of a skeptical approach to things, don't be so certain, you think that everything's real and what's real might not be real. One of the opening lines of the Dao De Jing of Lao Tzu is, I think it's the second or the third verse, where he says something like, when people know what is good, that's not good. When people know what is bad, that is bad. And it seems kind of like, what? That's not, isn't it good when people know the good? Isn't it bad? No, what he's saying is, when you think you have this rigid, oh, I know it's good, I know it's bad, you really don't. It's a lot more complicated than that. It's more than meets the eye. There's more subtlety to things. So this sort of mitigated kind of skepticism and not trying to rush to judgment, that's a big part of the Taoist tradition. So one who embraces the Tao, again, you both yield and overcome. That seems, again, rather paradoxical, yet it's a central ethical principle of Taoism. It's known as Wu Wei. Your textbook, I think, says actionless action. I think it literally means no action or non-action. The title of the book here, Effortless Action, is what it has. This book, I've never read it. I just found this on the internet, right? So it doesn't mean like you're just like some wuss that just sits there and puts up with everything, right? It's pure effectiveness. It's not passive, okay? You don't meddle with the smooth course of nature. It's like a good metaphor, trying to swim upstream from the river. If you try to swim upstream from the river, you're not going to win. I don't care how strong your arms are, how strong your legs are. Eventually, the river's going to win. It's not going to give up. So the way of the universe, you have to tap into that way and know how to flow with it. And it doesn't mean you just give up. It's just you understand the course of things and follow them. So there's no intentional or invasive action, rather non-action or effortless action. It's a spontaneous creative activity proceeding from the Tao, proceeding from the way of the universe. The example I like to give to try to explain this is actually, I'm going to rip off Xuanzu here. He and I love this example. If you're a vegetarian, it might offend you, or vegan, sorry. So trigger warning, I guess. But yeah, so like, I love it because I used to be a butcher. I used to work as a meat cutter, I guess technically is actually the title. I was a meat cutter. I worked at a supermarket at Whole Foods, and I would cut meat. And so I kind of like this example. But he talks about this butcher who has the way. So through wu wei, through effortless action, but by cutting between what isn't, right, between the joints, and he, his knife, Xuanzu says, never has to be sharpened, right? A good butcher, he says, has to sharpen his blades once or twice a year or once or twice a season. A really crappy butcher has to sharpen his blades like every day. But the master butcher who has the way never has to sharpen he's used the same blade since the beginning, but never has to sharpen his blade because he always cuts at the joint. He always cuts right at the right place. And if he comes to a difficult spot, he doesn't tense up. He doesn't get all shaky and think, oh, how do I do this technically and do it? It's at this angle by 65 degrees and 35 and that. No, he's just like, okay, just be calm, be cool. Just follow the flow, go around and go through it, and then it goes through, right? And then the knife does the trick, right? So the butcher, right, has the way, right? He has that skill. He understands how to move through and how to carve the animal, the carcass, in the proper way of nature, right? The way it's there. I'm sorry, vegans. I know that's probably pretty offensive. Oh my God, he's talking about cutting up animals. I'm just getting sick. Okay, sorry. There are other, maybe better example of Wu Wei. I used to work another job I used to have when I used to work in restaurants, right? I worked service so long, since I was like 15 till heck, even out of grad school. First year I was teaching college students, and then I was serving them cheeseburgers on the weekend at the local burger joint to make ends meet. Because believe it or not, college professors don't make much money these days, unless you're just super lucky and get a tenure position, which do those exist anymore? Please let me know in the comments below if they do. But anyway, they're becoming a thing of the past. I digress though. Back to this notion of Wu Wei. Sometimes I'd have these managers, I think they're like more the Confucian managers. When you're working like the restaurant, one job I had, there's a dickhead manager, and he was like so by the book. Like everything had to be done by the book. When you were working there in the kitchen, like I remember it was a burger place. This was like right out of high school. I think I was like 19 or 20, and you were only allowed to cook like 10 burgers on the grill at a time. So if the manager walked by and saw more than 10 burgers, he like get all mad at the cook and say, according to the corporate policy, you can only cook 10 at a time. He's like, yeah, but we got this whole range, and look how busy the line is. And they're like, well, you couldn't drop a burger until you ordered it. And he's the kind of weasel that's just like breathing down your neck every step of the way. And whenever there was that manager, and this one is in my head right now. This is a type. I've had these type of managers my whole career, working 20 plus years in restaurants. You get these dickhead managers that just are such sticklers for the rule. Their whole shift, they're just walking around looking for nitpicky stuff to yell at you for not doing correctly or by the book. And every time that manager's on shift, I'm kid you not, maybe this is the Taoist in me, things go to hell, everyone that's working there is all tense and worried, right? They're not just doing their job and just waiting tables. They're like, oh crap, where's homeboy? Where's the manager? Is he gonna, they're on edge and nervous and worried. And so I think Chuang or Lao Tzu would say, this manager sucks, right? He does not manage with the Tao. Now, contrast that with the same job I was talking about earlier, the burger job. There was this other manager who was chill as hell, and you never saw him. The whole shift, he'd be back in the office getting paperwork done, or back in the back cooler reorganizing inventory, getting ready for inventory. The only time you would see him was when we got slammed. When we got super, super duper busy and we got really in trouble, he would jump to the front and maybe get on the extra register. He would jump and with the guys in the grill and help them get organized and go get them some buns if they were out of hamburger buns. So, he didn't get in the way and get it all in our face and in our work unless he was needed and useful, right? And so, this sort of, I think, fits to the butcher analogy, right? It's sort of like the one who manages with the way is sort of like the butcher who butchers with the way, right? Yeah, he just slices through. He doesn't hack through all in a hurry. He does it calmly. When he comes to a tough point, then he does stop and concern, but he doesn't overdo it. He doesn't get all stressed out about it. Right. So again, I feel like you get the point. Okay. But I feel this notion of Wu Wei is a very paradoxical notion. But once you sort of give a few examples, it's not so crazy. I think it's not so like these Taoists, what are Taoists, stupid. I think a lot of Westerners react to like Asian, Eastern philosophy in this way because of the way it's expressed. It's like, oh, that's real deep. It is pretty deep, actually. I think it is pretty deep. I think you're just so used to things being one or the other. That's actually not deep. So like, anyways, I digress, right? Obviously I have a bit of an affinity towards this tradition, so take that as it will. I should put my bias on the table here. One thing I really don't think is that, what, I guess here's where I digress even more. Feng shui, right? This is something you might have heard of, feng shui, the idea that uh, furniture, things can be organized in a way that the flow of energy is optimized, right? So you might see people actually make a living doing this, right? They'll charge a lot of money to, come into a person's house and tell them like whether their house has good feng shui or not, and they'll reorganize their furniture. I think most of this is, I mean, sorry if you take offense to this, but I think most of it's rip-off artists. I really do. I think that there's something to it. Don't get me wrong. I think there's something to it. Like there's a way to organize your room that's kind of like, it's open, it allows you to have sort of this openness, and it definitely has psychological effects. If you live in a cluttered room, there's definitely something to it. But I think that this idea that there's this cosmic, I don't know, I guess I'm always this eternal skeptic. So Qi we've already talked about. This is that energy, and feng shui again is organizing things in your world, in your life, the objects around you, to optimize the flow of that energy. The ethical effects of Taoist philosophy are designed, again, to harmonize with the cosmos. Heaven, earth, and humanity all arise from the same source, from the way, from the Tao. So all things on earth should be loved and allowed to exist and develop according to their nature. When we get to like organized and folk Taoism, right, we'll start talking about some of the deities here, right? This really goes back to like 2nd century. So this is after Lao Tzu. This is in like the early sort of disorganized sort of dynastic traditions and more or less organized traditions. This is sort of like what that becomes as it filters its way through Lao Tzu. Okay, now we're talking about, a little bit later, but drawing from both of these ancient traditions. It's going to employ practices like alchemy, faith healing, sorcery, using ancient talismans, intricate rituals. There'll be clergy, texts that are revealed, true texts that are revealed by Taoist sages. And many believe in invisible spirits that are involved in their destiny, and they have to pay respect to these spirits through ritual. And if you're interested, there are I think that the name of the documentary, I'm sorry if I get the title wrong, The Way and Its Nature, or The Way of Nature. It's in the links for my students in D2L. It's in the optional documentaries under Unit 2. So there's a documentary on Taoism, and really it's just about Chinese spiritual traditions. It's not just Taoism. It talks a little bit about Confucianism and Buddhism, but they go to some of these smaller villages in rural China, and you see some of these intricate funeral. I think there's a funeral ritual that they are able to document, and they seem chaotic, but every step of it is actually choreographed. So it's definitely worth watching. I think it's an interesting documentary. Again, like a lot of the documentaries I post, it's older, and so I think it's a little bit more slow paced. It might be, for the short attention span of your modern viewer, they might be a little much, but maybe you can watch it in a few sittings, or just fast forward to the part that I'm talking about. I don't mean to insult you, by the way. Sorry. I just find this is the case. Like, I try to watch movies with people that I think are really interesting, and my friends are just like bored out of their gourd. So they're friends of mine. They're not dumb. I just think they're used to watching boom, bam, jing, boom, like Marvel comic crap. So, which I love too. I love Marvel comics, but they don't have the patience to sit through. And here we are in the village of Donghong, and we're going to, it's like they just can't, can't deal with that. I guess I'm just nerdy like that. But one of the spirits, so we're talking about like, certain rituals. I'm not going to go over it. There's thousands, hundreds of them. It's almost like the Hindu tradition. Every village might have their own spirit. But we're going to go over some of the main ones. These are mentioned in your textbook. One is the kitchen god, or the kitchen spirit. And it's usually worshipped at the family level. So it's something that you're going to see in the home of, traditional Chinese family, or really not just Chinese, but maybe even parts of, Taiwan and Thailand and other parts of the Far East. Now, it's going to be in the corner of the kitchen is usually where you're going to find like a shrine to the kitchen god. It's supposed to watch over the family's activities throughout the year, and it makes this yearly report of their failings to the Jade Emperor. And so like there's many humorous ruses that are like you see here, people will put food and they'll put like really sticky candy as offerings to the kitchen spirit, and it's sort of a joke that he'll eat them and his mouth will be so sticky that he can't tell the Jade Emperor like all the bad and naughty stuff that that he's done. But in popular practice, many people vow to do a good deed if their prayer's answered, and they usually offer the prayer to a spirit. And sometimes it's done on a large scale. Sometimes it's done in their home, like like the Hindus do their bhakti worship. Sometimes it's very very personal, very private. Certain people who have acted virtuously in their life are often worshipped as divine. When they die, they're appointed a heavenly office after they die. And the institutionalization of these ritual practices, they start to happen around the Han Dynasty period. And I thought I had a slide for, I guess I didn't. My bad. I thought I had another timeline here for the Han Dynasty, but it's Han Dynasty's 200 to 220. Actually, sorry, 200 BC to 220 CE. So it lasts over 400 years. And during the decline of it, this is when the ritualistic practices that you see in modern day schools of Taoism that still do these rituals, this is when it starts to develop. There's this large scale rebellion that overthrows the Han. And after this long period of war and famine, this celestial masters tradition develops, and it replaces the old system of deities, spirits, and the cosmology of the Han. Now, the celestial masters tradition still thrives in Taiwan and Hong Kong today, but you've also got other offshoots. Like you've got highest purity Taoism, which is like a southern China school. It develops around 365 CE. It's also sometimes translated as the supreme clarity or highest clarity school. And it's founded by this aristocratic ruler, Wei Hukan. In your textbook, it says Lady Wei. That's very misleading. Now, she is Lady Wei because she's royalty, so of course any royalty would be lady. But if you look up Lady Wei in Wikipedia, you're going to get a very famous woman in Chinese calligraphy. So I don't know why your textbook doesn't put her actual name. It's very misleading, and so do not confuse the two. Lady Wei is not Wei Hukan, the founder of the highest purity Taoism. But this school is one of the there's many more schools than the ones that are mentioned in your textbook. I don't know much about them. I don't know much about these, to be perfectly honest with you. Again, I'm more of interested in the books of Lao Tzu and Xuanzhu and the philosophical Taoism. But as far as I can tell, the highest purity is one of the first or the earliest schools to invoke a kind of shamanistic approach. The idea that there's this woman who's a shaman who receives revelations. Lady Wei, this woman, is apparently hears voices from these new deities. She hears about new meditative techniques, new alchemic techniques, new ways to write calligraphy. And so she becomes a part of, I guess she founds the school. She's the sort of traditional founder, which is now centered around Mount Mao. And actually, highest purity Taoism saw the celestial masters tradition as crude, right? As associated with commoners. So this is sort of like the elite intellectual. We go meditate, we go on retreats, we go to Mount Mao, up above the villagers. They didn't like the village rituals, the stuff that I was talking about in the documentary. Again, they focus on meditation. They see this is the way to purify the body. Meditation is a way. So you can see, again, this is almost like a Buddhist approach, almost like a Zen Buddhist form of Taoism. It was never widespread, though. Surprise, surprise. This approach was never widespread amongst the masses. But obviously, its texts and influence do have some sort of. They do touch upon the Taoist tradition outside of itself, and even some Buddhist traditions, right? When we talk about Zen texts, if some Zen schools actually do. I've been to some Zen libraries at some Zen schools that had Taoist books, okay, and some of them I'm imagining could be from this the High Purity School. Now the Numinous Treasure School as another book mentioned in your textbook, they don't say much about it, but it's 4th century, so the 300s, and it assimilates elements of Buddhism, and it succeeded in the 12th century by the complete perfection school. This is probably why they didn't say much about the numinous treasure, because it just turns into a different school, which continues to this day. It's more monastic, okay, so it focuses on non-attachment, going to the monastery, and it unites teachings from Taoism, the Taoist inner alchemy, sort of how to use the alchemy within, the chemicals, the forces within you to achieve enlightenment and oneness and harmony with all that is. So again, the complete perfection school focuses on that, much like the high purity Taoism. It uses Buddhist meditation, and Confucian social morality is also integrated into this school. The Cloud Monastery is the headquarters for the complete perfection school, and this is in Beijing. So one of the biggest cities in China. So the president, if not the biggest, is Beijing the biggest? I guess it is. I'm trying to think. Is Shanghai, Hong Kong? I think Beijing is the largest city in China. So the canon itself, we don't want to talk too much about. I think knowing about Lao Tzu and knowing about Dao De Jing is probably enough. Most of the other texts are specific to the schools. And according to your textbook, I didn't know this, but there's over 1,500 scriptures that have been compiled, and the canon, right, the ones that are seen as official, were pretty much around the same time, of the age of exploration in the West. Around 1444 is when the current Taoist canon was compiled, and again, it's about 1,500 different books, and only recently have Westerners started to study it. So that's probably why I don't know a whole lot about it at all. So we'll talk about Tudigong shrines here in a moment. But a lot of these books contain mystical forms of Taoism. So talking about mystical practices, and a lot of them are seen as accounts, like stories told by the practitioners themselves who have achieved these higher states. They include poems of visionary shamanistic journeys, encounters with deities, meditative practices, how to meditate properly, descriptions of the perfect human being, how to actualize perfection in oneself, methods and elixirs for ascending to heavenly realms, how to achieve immortality. Again, this gets very supernatural, very mystical. Descriptions of the immortals, and also descriptions of these heavenly bureaucracies, these heavenly hierarchies. So every temple you're going to see, pretty much every temple, most temples you're going to see, they're going to have these Tudigong shrines outside of them. Now, Tudigong is the lord of the earth, and he's thought to be able to transport offerings to your deceased loved ones. Okay, so this is to honor the dead. Religious Taoism in general, right? We can talk a little bit about this. The notion of day, like the Dao De Jing, the word day, can be understood as power or augmented power. In Lao Tzu, it's usually just power or efficient power, but in religious Taoism, it's understood as augmented. So religious Taoism, you want to tap into this. You want to tap into this augmented power. How do you do this? Well, there's many methods. You read the books, they'll tell you all these methods. Change your diet, certain herbs are medicinal for you, certain sexual practices can get you to this state, breathing practices involving your whole body, obviously meditation, exercise, hygiene, mind exercises, certain postures. We'll talk a little bit about Qigong and Tai Chi at the end of the lecture. But the idea is that there's a need for exact rituals to unlock the Tao, to unlock this flow, this way of the universe, and to utilize this higher power or the gods, the deities, to help our own personal life. There's believed to be this correspondence between the macrocosm and the microcosm, between the universe and the human. We have to bring order to the cosmos. That's one of our first sort of duties, right? Bring order in our lives, and through that to all else, and bring oneness to the cosmos. So, the idea is that the seasons are the macrocosm, our limbs are the micro planets, organs, right? So there's this sort of parallel between the individual and the universe, and we have to sort of dive into that, tap into that, and find oneness. And there's this very specific system, much like the Hindu system. You'll read some of the early Vedic scriptures, and they get very specific about numbers, how many years in a cycle, and down to the 100,000th, But there's apparently in the Taoist cosmology, in the sort of religious Taoism, there's a total of 10,000 things in the world. Zero is the Tao. When you reach the Tao and you become one with the Tao, everything is unified and all is reduced to the one. One is Qi, two is Yin Yang, three is heaven, earth, and humans, four spring, summer, autumn, winter, so the seasons, five for the directions, I guess centers where you start, and there's the four directions from that. So for each number represents all things, and we sort of break it all down until we let go of that through these different practices. So the divinities in Taoism, there are these sort of four levels. You've got the gods at the top. They're the most powerful. Only they can alter or bring deliverance, although they're not creators. Again, they're not a part of the creation of the universe. It's not this Judeo-Christian notion of God as the one creator deity. The immortals are right below. They're beings who were once human, but they become transcendent through the practice of Taoism. They reveal scripture to humanity out of great compassion for us. Sounds like the bodhisattva that we saw in Buddhism. Then there's also ancestor spirits. There are these benevolent spiritual beings known as Shen, right? S-H-E-N. And then the Kvi, or Kvai, no, actually, Kve, I think is how you say that. Kve, or demons. These are malevolent spirits. Sometimes someone will die in an unjust or violent way, and so they'll be stuck as this sort of being, this Kaveh. So the Taoist gods were never human. The gods at the top of the hierarchy were never human. The Jade Emperor, Huang Huang, that's the highest one, Shangdi. They're usually given sort of these militaristic titles. You've also got the macrocosmic deities, the God of heaven, God of earth, God of humanity, Lord of heaven, right? He is the head. That's his microcosm, right? The Lord of earth is the heart, which represents pure potential, and the Lord of humanity is the abdomen. That's the lower cauldron, right? So that's sort of they're the macro, heaven, earth, and humanity, representing the micro within each individual. So many forms of Taoism focus on, again, individual spiritual practices for the for the sake of self cultivation, and they use this, the notion of qi, this available energy, to perceive order in the universe through meditative practice, through sexual practice, through all sorts of interesting things, right? It's a very diverse tradition, you could say. So some more terminology here, right? Within our bodies, believed to be a spiritual microcosm of the three treasures. These are necessary for the preservation of life. So there's the generative force, the Xing, there's the vital force, Qi, and then there's the spirit, or Shen, okay? The inner cauldron begins with beginner cauldron, the beginner alchemy, right? How do we sort of use the Tao in ourselves and transform ourselves? What sort of alchemy do we use? This is a description that I paraphrase from the book, and it's going to sound a lot like the description of Sassen and a lot of other meditative descriptions we've seen throughout the description. It seems like a lot of these meditative practices, although they use different terminology, they seem to be pointing to similar things. So again, the idea is that there's this inner alchemy, this sort of inner alchemy within us that begins with the practitioner building a reservoir of energy, of this force, this Qing energy, in our cauldron, right, several inches below our navel. It rises to the spine as vapor transmitted into Qi, the life force, down to our heart center, descending to an inner area called the lower cauldron. And there it forms the immortal fetus. That it's sort of adepts, people that are really good at this, or apparently can raise this through the heavenly gate to the top of their head and leave their physical bodies, and for various purposes like preparing for life after death, etc., etc. This sounds a little bit like Kundalini practices of yoga, right, in Hinduism, right? Kundalini and the sort of lotus, the idea of all the seven chakra, and the top one being sort of complete release. This seems to take a little bit of step further, though, that you're able to leave your body and sort of do all sorts of things. It's just a spirit. Obviously, some scholars, you might be thinking now, if you haven't gathered, and I'm sort of this opinion as well. Of course, maybe I just don't know enough about it, and I haven't studied enough about it. But I think some of these just seem anathema to Lao Tzu. That these practices do not seem proper for the teachings of Xuanzu, the teachings of Lao Tzu. And she points this out in our textbook. Some scholars argue these practices ignore the basic teachings of philosophical Taoism. Xuangzu was unconcerned with birth and death. Lao Tzu is speaking of immortality not as physical permanence, but as eternal spiritual life and longevity. But nevertheless, you've got all this literature and all these folk tales that are filled with references to immortal sages and centuries-old deities who live hidden in the mountains, away from society. They're said to be somewhat translucent, and the most famous are the 8 immortals. They each have their own magical power. I guess these are more modern renditions. That's kind of almost like an anime-looking version of the 8 immortals. There's also the Queen Mother of the West. She's supposed to guard the elixir of life and its yin energy. There are also several female Taoist sages in the canon. Now, I mentioned posturing as a proper way of tapping into the Tao, certain physical postures. Tai Chi is a practice of this. It's a practice of physical postures that we think was developed all the way back in the 17th century, primarily for martial arts. But it's considered to be manifestations of unobstructed flow of qi through our body. So that's Tai Chi in general. There's also Qigong, which is known as a self-cultivation system. You use meditation, breath control, martial arts, diet in order to fight disease. So this is just another school of posturing and with all sorts of other philosophical and religious frameworks behind it. But some people approach it completely secularly. You don't have to be a Taoist to practice Qigong or Tai Chi. And then last but not least, we're getting to the controversial part here. This is Falun Gong or Falun Dafa. This school, it literally means the Dharma wheel practice or low wheel practice. It's a form of Qigong. It's a form of, the sort of the self-cultivation systems that mixes Buddhists and Taoists practices. This is actually the symbol here. The swastika throws people off. Yeah, the swastika is an ancient symbol. Okay, so in this class, we're going to have to show it. It's not meant to provoke you. Sorry, but this is their official symbol. They still use it today. If you go, like I said, you go to certain parts of Houston, you go to a Buddhist temple. If you go to the Hong Kong market over there off Bel Air in Chinatown, you will see shrines that have the symbol. Okay, so again, Falun Gong, they're persecuted in China. That's why I say this is controversial. They emphasize, again, Buddhist and Taoist energy postures and practices, and they emphasize ethics, like cardinal virtues like truthfulness, benevolence, forbearance, and they've been politically oppressed in China since 1999, since the late Clinton era, right? So here you see some Falun Gong activists who are protesting, right? And so again, there's a lot of pushback from the Chinese government, and I have had students from China who do not have a very positive view of the Falun Gong people, and they think that they're provocateurs who spread lies. So I don't know where to stand. I've never been to China. I don't know any Falun Gong practitioners. So I should shut up. I have really nothing to say about it, but it's something you should be aware of, right? It's definitely a political reality in our time. This is all I wanted to say about Taoism, one of my favorite traditions to talk about. Obviously, I think maybe that's apparent from my digressions in this video. This was a bit longer than I had anticipated. So thank you if you stayed here till the end. For my students, there's also a discussion of Xuangzu and Lao Tzu posted up in D2L. You can listen to that. I don't think I'll put it on my YouTube channel unless there's a hot demand for it. Otherwise, thanks a lot for watching, and I hope to see you guys on the other side for the next video. We're moving on to Confucianism next, so that should be very interesting, another fascinating tradition. Cheers.